I'm of two minds about this microphone. Can you hear me well without it? Or do you think I should keep it? Keep it. All right. Okay. First of all, thank you so much for the beautiful introduction, this amazing poem you've chosen. I think both to Hand the Eagle and to the Asia House. It's a pleasure for me to be here. But to be honest, I did not come here to deliver a speech, to deliver, a monologue. I don't like monologues. I like dialogues. So I would appreciate it enormously if we can turn this into a dialogue, all of us together. Please do share your questions with me, your comments, your critical remarks, anything you agree or disagree. I would love to carry on together. But if I may, I would like to perhaps tell you a little bit about my own journey. Maybe, I don't want to call it spiritual journey, but perhaps that is what it is. And in which Rumi, but also Shams of Tabriz, played a great role. I became interested in Sufism, in mysticism, in my early 20s in college. I was maybe 20, 21, if not earlier. And it was a bit of a coincidence for me to become interested in this subject, because I did not grow up in such a household. I grew up in a very Kemalist, secularist household, and I've always appreciated secularism. Yet at the same time, I was raised by a grandmother who was very superstitious, if you will, very irrational, full of magic. Her house was full of magic. And I think that too left an impact on me. So on the one hand was my mother, who was very well educated, westernized, modern, independent, very urban. And on the other hand, my grandmother was much more Eastern, if I may put it this way. And what struck me most, I think, was the possibility of sisterhood between them, the possibility of solidarity between them. And it was that solidarity that changed not only my mother's life, but also my life. So the impact of that solidarity went on for maybe 3 or 4 generations onwards. Because it was my grandmother who supported my mother's education when she came back from France, where I was born. She came back from France, 19 years old. She was when she got married, and she had quit university. She had dropped out of university, thinking love would be enough. She wouldn't need anything else. And when her marriage collapsed, when she came back from France, from Strasbourg, where we used to live, she had a toddler in her arms, no diploma, no career, no job, no money, nowhere to go to. And usually women in such positions are immediately married off in Turkey, usually to older men, because they are not very favorable in the marital market anymore. And just when our nosy neighbors were looking for suitable husbands, it was my grandmother who intervened and who said, no, you go back to university, I'm going to take care of my grandchild. You should have options in life. If you want to get married, get married. If you want to have a career, have a career. But then it will be, choices, not mandatory. And that's exactly what my mother did. She went back to university, she graduated with flying colors, and then she became a diplomat, after which she and I traveled a lot. But the reason why I mention this is because my grandmother's intervention left a big impact. And this woman was a very spiritual woman in her own way. I dare say, in an almost non-religious way. There was a time when my parents got separated, around the time I was 6, 7 years old. And I want to mention that too, because I think it's relevant to our talk. That summer, I spent half of the summer with my paternal grandmother in Izmir. That's my father's side is from, in Turkey. And I spent half of the summer, the rest of the summer, with my maternal grandmother in Ankara. And these two women, although they were both Turkish, at first glance they're both Muslim, Sunni, they come from more or less same class background, age group, everything seems very, very similar. They couldn't be more different. And their approach to religion was almost exactly the opposite. When I went to Izmir, my paternal grandmother's house, I remember it very clearly. She opening my suitcase, checking my clothes, not finding them appropriate, thinking short sleeves were not proper for a girl, checking the books I was reading. I remember very clearly there are things that stayed with me. The Quran in her house on the wall in a very beautiful pearly case, but unreachable, inaccessible, not supposed to, you're not supposed to read it, you just respect it, but you shouldn't question, you shouldn't connect with it, with the book. And her understanding of God was very much based on the Jalal notion of God. And I dare say, I think it was also based on fear, a lot of fear. So she taught me about hell, she taught me about sin, she taught me that God was a celestial gaze, always watching me, unblinking, not a single second of blink, because I was trying to understand if he blinks, maybe he won't see me in that second. It terrified me, and I was trying to understand, does he also watch me when I'm in the bathroom? There are moments when you don't want to be seen, and no, always watching you, not only watching you, but he knows what you think. He knows all the dark thoughts that might cross your mind. So I remember coming back from her house pretty traumatized and unable to go to the bathroom, a little bit hysterical, And then in this state I came back to Ankara. And my maternal grandmother, in her house too there was a Quran, but it was on the shelf. You could take it, you could open it, you could read it, you could ask questions, you could put it back, yeah? Girl or boy, man or women, you could reach it. I think that made a big difference. And secondly, her understanding of God was based on the Jamal side of God, which is the beauty of God. So her God was more Rahman, it was more compassionate, it was the kindness, and it was always love. And I also remember asking her, is God watching me in the bathroom? Shall I go? Her response was, I'm sure he has more important things to do. So there was room for humor, there was room for lightness, and it wasn't that fearful anymore. And I forgot this experience. Many, many, many years went by. I arrived in college, I became interested in, little by little, mysticism, mostly through books. Most of the things in my life came to me through books. I was a very lonely child, books were my best friends. So I think books were my gates to lots of things in life. And it's not a coincidence that I became interested in Sufism through books. One little footnote you find in a book leads you to another book, you read it, then you start reading another book. And only when I started reading Shams of Tabriz, which I have started reading before Rumi, usually it's the other way around. It could be any way, actually, but in my case, I think Shams came before, or through Shams I discovered Rumi's voice. And only as I was reading Shams of Tabriz and later on Rumi, I remembered my two grandmothers' contrasts. And that stayed with me, and I realized we need to emphasize more and more the Muslim world is not a monolithic whole. It never has been a monolithic whole. There have been various interpretations of the same book, yeah? And throughout centuries it was always like that. Today too it's quite diverse, dynamic. Some of these interpretations coexisted, some of them clashed. But there have been differences. In fact, the Sufis say there are as many paths to truth as the number of hearts beating for God. So an approach that emphasizes plurality, an approach that emphasizes multiplicity, I realized cannot reduce the path to one single way, cannot say, my way is the right way and I'm going to impose it on you. So that emphasis on plurality to me is very, very important. You might disagree with me, but I want to share with you all these thoughts. We can debate afterwards. In Turkey, I find it very difficult to talk about these subjects because we have lost our nuances. We're a very polarized society, and usually the expectation throughout my university years especially, but later on as well, was if you are a religious person, then just be religious, and if you are a modern person, then you should have no interest whatsoever in these issues. So it's either that or that. And I always found that duality very limited and unproductive. Can't we have other paths? So individually, I am not a religious person at all. I don't think I'm even a believer, to be honest. But I'm someone who appreciates, who respects, and who is intrigued by faith. Okay? And who is intrigued by the quest for God or the possibility of God. What I'm interested in is individual spiritual journeys. And I believe those journeys are unique, just like our fingerprints. You might start with agnosticism, you might end up your path becoming a believer. You might start as someone, being interested in Sufism, you might end up your journey in a completely different place. Only you will know, because you know the seasons you've gone through, you know the stages you've gone through. My problem with both the extremely religious and rigidly atheist people is that they take things for granted. They see the floor, the ground beneath their feet as something very solid. In other words, they have what I call the malady of certainty. They're very, very certain. Whereas I like people who are a little bit more confused. Maybe agnostics, maybe mystics, maybe misfits. People who have questions and who can say, you know what, I don't know, but I'm learning. I'm still learning. People who can still say at the age of 80, at the age of 90, I am still learning. I admire that. And how many people we have met in our lives who can say, I don't know yet, I'm learning. So what I'm trying to say is, rather than people who claim to have found the answers, what I feel closer to is people who appreciate the questions. And those questions keep us moving. So I'm interested in the dance between faith and doubt. I think in life we need both. My criticism towards very religious people is that they want to get rid of doubt. And my criticism towards very or rigidly atheist people is that they want to get rid of faith. Well, we need both. Because without doubt, faith is a dogma. And dogmas are very dangerous. They keep us away from not only reality, but also disconnected from each other. They freeze us, they freeze our souls, and they stop the journey of the soul, the journey of the mind. So dogmas are dangerous. We need doubt in life. We need to be able to say, I'm not 100% sure, this is what I feel, this is what I believe, but I'm open to learning more. I'm open to your criticism. On the other hand, I think we also need faith in life. And there are non-religious acts of faith as well. There are secular acts of faith as well. For instance, when you move to a new country and you don't really know why you're doing it, you don't really know if you're going to be happy there, but you do it anyhow. You follow almost a gut instinct. It's a secular act of faith. When you start writing a novel, you have no idea if you're going to succeed or fail miserably, but you do it anyhow. It's a secular act of faith. When you fall in love with someone and you start maybe a relationship or a family together, it is a secular act of faith. There's faith there. So there are lots of pools of faith, islands of faith in our lives that are not necessarily religious or connected to religion. I guess what I'm trying to say is what I'm uncomfortable with is when organized religions make a distinction between us versus them, and when they presume that us is somehow closer to truth than them. I don't find that close to my heart. But individually, each and every one of us, whatever our story, whatever our background, our quest, our journey, the way we dare to ask questions and look for the answers, the way we choose to be learners in life, that modesty, that confusion, whatever we call that path, to me is very, very precious. So I've never felt comfortable in any dualistic format in Turkey. However, I believe these are important issues that we should be able to talk about. Now, coming back to Shams of Tabriz, coming back to Rumi, or people like Rabia, Ibn Arabi, I think these people were very, very much aware of the multiplicity of heartbeats, of the multiplicity of paths. At the end of the day, I'm not an expert on Rumi. and I would never claim such a thing, but I have read his work throughout the years so many times. I have written my thesis, my master's thesis on Islamic mysticism and the circular understanding of time. This is a subject that I enjoy reading, writing about, thinking about, but I also know that it has no boundaries. In other words, I think if you brought together the mystics and the misfits of all Abrahamic religions and you organized a banquet for them, I think they would share bread. They would break bread together. I think they would share the same water. So people like Teresa de Avila, right, when you look at the history of Christianity, or Meister Eckhart, or when you look at the history of Judaism, like Isaac Luria, Abu Lafia, mystics, or the history of Islam, like Ibn Arabi and Rabia, these people, I can see them dining around the same table. They were saying very similar things. They've never met each other, they've never seen each other, but the things they said were so similar, not only within the Abrahamic traditions, but also towards the Far East. As you travel, the similarities are enormous if we are interested in the core quest, in that spiritual journey. But if we're only interested in those superficial distinctions and labels and the fear, haram and halal, and when you go in that direction, you disconnect more and more, and then categorical distinctions become all the more important. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is there is a big difference in how we approach things. The Batini approach has always been more interested in the core. The Zahiri approach has always been interested in the surface, the rules, regulations, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, how you perform, how you behave. They're very different approaches. For me, it's important to emphasize that multiplicity. I also think in today's world, there are lots of questions that are being asked across the Muslim world in particular, but all around the world. But I think it's not a coincidence that women are asking many questions. Because we women have much more to lose when societies go backward. If societies tumble down into fanaticism or authoritarianism or populism, we have much more to lose than men. And it's that I listen to women as I travel in the Middle East, in Turkey, lots of questions, passionate questions. The problem is we don't hear their voices in the public space. And we have to bring those voices from the private space into the public space. In my new novel, my recent novel is called Three Daughters of Eve. Usually we talk about the sons of Adam. We rarely talk about the daughters of Eve. That's a big, blank. I wanted to emphasize that I like silences. I think all writers like stories, but also we like silences. When I say like, we're intrigued by the silences, the things we don't talk about, people who don't have a voice, people who've been pushed to the periphery, minorities, all kinds of minorities, anyone who feels like the other, anyone who feels lonely in a particular situation. I think a writer's job is to give more voice to the voiceless. So I chose the title deliberately, and in that book I want to share it with you. There are three women, all of them come from Muslim backgrounds. They're all students at Oxford University. And there is Shirin, who is Iranian-British. She's the child of exiled parents who had to run away from fanaticism, from fundamentalism. And Shirin herself is a passionate atheist. She's critical of all religions, but in particular she's critical of Islam because of the situation of women and because of lack of gender equality. Then there's Mona, the second girl, is Egyptian American. She wears a headscarf. She's a practicing Muslim, and she complains about Islamophobia, which is something she experiences almost on a daily basis. And the third girl is from Turkey. She has lots of questions. Her name is Piri. Together, they call themselves, jokingly, the sinner, the believer, and the confused. And this is a book that very much focuses on the journey of the confused and the confusions of our times. Sometimes in interviews, people ask me, oh, are you Piri because she is the Turkish girl, or are you this one or that one? But I'd like to think that they can all inhabit one, they can all exist in the same person. Can it not be that way? Do we have to think of these girls as completely different personalities? In some ways they are, of course, but even in each and every one of us, maybe we went through stages when we were, like Mona, we were more firmly believers. We went through stages like Shirin, when we became angry, more critical, questioning. Maybe we went through stages like Peri, when we had lots of confusions. Can it not be that way? But more importantly for me, I think, is the question, can these girls, if they are three different women, three different types of womanhood, let's say, can they be sisters? Can they be friends? Can there be the kind of sisterhood or solidarity that I have seen between my mother and my grandmother back in my childhood? And this is a question that matters a lot to me, because in my motherland, in Turkey, I have not seen this happening. Just the opposite. In countries where politics is so divisive, is so aggressive, women too are divided into categories, depending on whether you're wearing headscarf, whether you are here or there, and then people don't break bread together. The banquet that we mentioned is no more. And that is a huge problem, because when women are divided so badly on the basis of what they wear, or on the basis of which political party they vote for, when the distances among women are so sharp, so big, I think the only thing that benefits from this is patriarchy itself. Yeah, when we are divided, we are weaker. So for me, empowering other women, sisterhood that transcends political borders, national, religious, class boundaries, is very important, is very crucial. And these are some of the things I wanted to question in this book. Now, I have to perhaps also add that I feel very grateful to the poems that I have read, the articles that I have read on not only Rumi and Shams of Tabriz, but in general on mysticism, because I think what they do to you is they not only change you intellectually, but they change your energy. And I've always believed that books change us. I don't like to see anyone as a role model, I don't think we need heroes in life. At the end of the day, each and every one of us is a human being, and being a human being means having lots of flaws, lots of conflicts. So of course we will learn from each other, but we shouldn't fetishize anyone. We shouldn't put anyone on a pedestal. So rather than finding, let's say, a master, I always felt that it's better to have our own individual journeys through books, through our own coincidences in life, which are perhaps never coincidental, and keep learning, just being open-minded and never be certain of anything. If you'd like, I can stop here. I'd be very happy to carry on with your questions, your comments. I don't know if we... Yes, please, yeah.
I finished 3 Daughters 3 last week, and I went through a whole kind of gamut of emotions with the 3 women, compassion, understanding, also anger and frustration, and recognised women around me all like that.
Absolutely.
I'm not that confused, I have questions too.
Sure.
But actually my question is about Turkish writers. At the moment, the situation is very difficult. Are there any options, jail or exile?
Sure. Yeah, it is.
Writers, academics,
Absolutely. I think we should start with journalists, because I believe journalism is the most difficult profession in Turkey today. Not only today, it has been going on for a long time, but it became worse and worse and worse. Today, it's very clear that Turkey became the world's biggest jailer of journalists. We have more than 150 journalists in prison. It has also been extremely tough on academics. Thousands of academics have been sacked. And when I say sacked, please try to understand, these people have no possibility of finding another job in another university in Turkey. So they not only, all their, let's say, benefits are just cut off, but entire families have been affected, and many of them do not even know why they are sacked for. no proper explanation. And as we're speaking, today is the 64th day of 2 academics on hunger strike, and they have passed a critical stage, life-threatening medical stage. So this has been going on for a long time, and of course it has also been, I think, tough for writers, because, and this is something we find difficult to talk about, but we must, when we write, let's say an article, when we give an interview, when we even tweet, we know that because of a word, because of a poem, because of an article, somebody will misunderstand, somebody will call us a traitor, and then the next day you can be sued, you can be almost lynched on social media, you can be put on trial, either detained, arrested, or exiled, unable to go back. So when we write, there's always this knowledge at the back of our minds. As a result, I believe there's widespread self-censorship in Turkey. And we don't talk about this because it's a very embarrassing thing. And it's also quite subtle. You know, how do you explain self-censorship? It's something you do to yourself. But we have internalized that fear. That said, I also think in Turkey there's an amazing civil society, and perhaps we don't hear the voices of these people as much as we should, we could have, or we should have, and they exist as well. There are lots of Democrats, progressive people, liberals, secularists, women, young people, students, minorities, anyone, again, who feels like the other for whatever reason. And these people also exist, you know. The problem is they're so fragmented. We're unable to understand that you can have diversity and unity together. You can have shared values. Unfortunately, Turkey is a country that has not appreciated diversity. And I think by losing that, we have lost a lot. Please.
Yes, you mentioned Shams Tabriz and Rumi, and over the last 10 years or so, Rumi has been widely read.
Sure.
You know, he's very popular in the US, but I feel that Shams has not been that mentioned. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? And is the same in Turkey? Is it the same that Shams Tabriz is not that widely mentioned or read?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you asked this. Yes, Rumi is of course universally much better known, beloved, read. At some point in America, Rumi's work was among the most widely read poets. And Shams of Tabriz is less well known everywhere, in Turkey as well. And of course, in many ways, Shams is a bit more difficult to connect to. He has anger as well. And interestingly, when you look at the sources, their spiritual relationship, their companionship, is described as the dance of fire and water. And it was Shams who was the fire, and it was Rumi who was the water. But what's most remarkable for me is to see how, first of all, they were so different, and yet they respected, understood each other, and they transformed each other. They allowed love to change them. How many of us can do that? Because we have such high egos. And when we love someone, we always say, my wife, my husband, mine. The emphasis is always on that me, the ego. How many of us allow ourselves to just completely transform? Of course, we must bear in mind that when they met, they were at they were very different personalities. There's a remarkable scene in which many sources write about when they met. Rumi was riding his horse. He had just given a sermon. He had disciples from all over not Anatolia, but further beyond Anatolia. And he was very well respected, he was very famous, and he was a scholar. He was not a poet. He was a scholar. And then when Shams comes, he is just, wearing black head to toe. He's described in the sources as maybe a mendicant dervish, like a heterodox dervish. And the dialogue between them is quite remarkable. What's interesting is after that companionship, Rumi stopped becoming a scholar and became a poet. And I think he changed Shams as well. It's mutual. So that is one of the reasons why, of course, not many people know Shams. The works, the literature on Shams of Tabriz is more limited. But what's interesting for me to see is how for both of them, Afghans say, no, Rumi belongs to us. The Turks say, no, no, no, Rumi belongs to us. Iranians say, Rumi belongs to us. And India, Pakistan, they say, actually, when Shams of Tabriz left Anatolia, they came to our land, they are ours. It's quite interesting. And of course, they belong to all humanity, not just one nation, one region, to entire humanity.
The Sufism in Iran and in India and that side has been based on poetry and songs and things like that. And it's affected, many of its Sufi writers are in the Sikh holy books, for instance. But in Iran, of course, Konya lived in Iran, and due to the Mongol invasion, he went to Turkey, in Konya. He's also supposed to have started the whirling dervishes, the dance, Sufi dance.
Yeah.
Could you explain how that happened, actually?
Yeah. I don't know if you've ever been at one of these performances. It's just remarkable. I think it's an experience that will stay with you, both the music and the dance itself. But I don't want to over-romanticize the city of Konya. Just like many other cities in Turkey, you will find the same, greedy construction there, big building blocks. So it's not necessarily at the first glance, it doesn't look like a very spiritual place. You have to perhaps search. And because in Turkey we're a society of collective amnesia, unfortunately, we don't have like signs, placards saying, this is where they met, this is where they lived. This was, of course there's a museum dedicated to Rumi, but that's about it. Memory is not scattered all over the city, that's what I'm trying to say. I find that very, very important. Also, I think so many voices of mysticism have been erased. Sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly, in today's Muslim world in general, because some of the questions these people were asking were just too radical, or too radical for our ears today, but they were genuine questions, and that freedom of speech is important. Coming back to the dance, I really find it remarkable. There's a place in Istanbul, there are very few places where men and women can whirl together. Usually it's male semazans. But in Galata, if you go, you will also be able to see the female semazans, which I find amazing.
Following the earlier question, the way I understand Sham's situation and position is he's a diamond cutter. He will refine unrefined diamond.
Mm-hmm.
So that his role has been.
Yeah.
So it's like example of a teacher. It's always the brilliant student who shines up, but the teacher remains in the background.
Yeah, of course.
So would you mind to explain on that?
Yes.
If the same situation happened in the Arabi, same situation happened with Rumi,
Of course.
he was a contributor to the both.
Of course, and absolutely, you're so right. And what they say is a true teacher will never say, I'm above you, and you should do exactly as I say. A true teacher will always keep at the back, stay at the back, and allow the talent, the beauty in that person to shine and to come out. So there's freedom there in that approach. I'm very glad that you mentioned Ibn Arabi. One of his main teachers was a woman. And it was a time when women could educate men. Yeah? Today it's almost unthinkable. We always think it has to be the other way around. In some ways, I think we've gone backwards, centuries of backwards. And when you read Ibn Arabi's poems, let us not forget he was put on trial for his poetry. And many people could not understand, are these poems written to God? Are they written to a beloved? They didn't understand that for Ibn Arabi, it was all connected, And one of his poems I find very striking, many of his poems, but one of them I want to mention. They ask him, are you a Muslim? Are you this? Are you that? And he says, I follow the caravan of love. He says, if that caravan goes towards the mosque, I will get out, enter the mosque, and pray inside the mosque. And the caravan will continue. Maybe it will stop in front of a synagogue. I will go inside and I will pray inside the synagogue. The caravan will continue, it will stop in front of a church. Then the church will be my abode of prayer. but the caravan will continue. Maybe we will pass through a desert, I will pray in the desert. Maybe we will pass through a forest, I will pray in the forest, because the journey is endless. And so I ask myself, how many people can recite this poem? How many people can think in this way? More fluid. Whereas today we're so obsessed with differences, with categories, with how this religion differs from that religion, and why is that one superior to that one. This is how we are approaching today the issue, in a very hierarchical and exclusivist way. Whereas for these people, it was inclusive, all-embracing, and there's an amazing humanism there that I sincerely believe we need to revive.
Can you tell us something about language and translation? Yes. And how you experience what you write in English and translation in Portuguese?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've been writing in English and in Turkish. My early novels were all written in Turkish first, and after a point, about 14 years ago, I switched to writing in English first. And at the time in Turkey, I was bitterly criticized for that. So many people, even among the literati, criticized me for abandoning my mother tongue, because for them it's always an either-or choice, as if you have to choose one thing and stick to it. But we can be multiple, and we are multiple already. And when we dream, when we go to sleep, the mind knows no such distinctions. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these experiences. Sometimes you start a dream in one language and then you continue in another language and you end up seeing words that you've never seen before. What language is that? So the mind is more fluid, more open. And I have always been intrigued by how we change as we move from one language to another. I think even our body language changes, our voice changes, our intonation changes. And that is because languages have an impact on us, they shape us. Whereas we tend to think that I am the master of the language, but languages have their own labyrinths. So I feel very connected to the Turkish language. I also feel very connected to the English language in completely different ways. When I write about humor, satire, irony, I definitely find it much easier in English. And if there's sorrow, melancholy, longing, I think Turkish is easier. And that's mostly because of a cultural distinction rather than a linguistic distinction. But I must also tell you, perhaps, you might be familiar with this. We in Turkey, back in the 1920s, 30s, we have Turkified our language. As you know, this used to be, when you go back in centuries, it was a multi-ethnic, the Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious empire. And as a result, when several languages, of course, were spoken, but when you look at the dominant language, the grammar, the syntax is Turkish. When you look at the vocabulary, there are lots of words coming from Arabic and Persian. There are also words coming from Ladino. There are also words coming from Armenian, and Greek influences are also there because everything is part of the same empire. So during the process of the Turkification of the language, hundreds of words have been plucked out because they were not Turkish originally. So when you look at an Ottoman dictionary, it is quite thick. If you look at a modern Turkish dictionary, it's almost half the size. Now, I as a writer have always felt uncomfortable with this and critical of this. And I want to give you an example. I can say yellow in Turkish, I can say red in Turkish, but the shades in between I cannot say anymore because they used to come mostly from Persian. So I have to describe them, like the color of melon, of cantaloupe. I have to find objects, but the words are gone. You see what I mean? So when I hear people in England saying chutzpah or kismet, and nobody says chutzpah is a Jewish word, wait a minute, or kismet is an Arabic word, wait a minute, it doesn't matter. It's all part of the language, it's organic, it is ongoing. I like that. I like that organic continuity, that inclusiveness. So unfortunately, with regards to even our language, we have some political debates in Turkey. Please.
I actually have two questions.
Sure.
One is Rumi's wife, Gohar Khatun, at the time when Shams was in his life. I did a play on Rumi about 10 years ago, and we portrayed her main characteristic as really giving unconditional love to Rumi throughout all this episode. So what is your opinion of Gohar Khatun? And the second question is that when he had, after Shams disappeared, he stopped being a scholar and became this mystic and semi-madman in between. What was the attitude of the establishment of him?
Yes. Thank you so much. It's very interesting, the story of his wife, also his sons.
Yes.
Yeah. And I wrote about their journey, their family members, and I wanted to structure the 40 rules of love in a way in which every person could just express their own opinions. That's why it's written in multiple and shifting voices. But I have to tell you, at the end of the day, what I present in that book is my interpretation of the story. I can never say this is the historical truth. This is the truth that I have imagined based on my own historical readings. Someone else might think of the story in a completely different way, and that's also, I think that should be welcome, all of those interpretations. So we cannot for sure know what Rumi's wife felt. Of course, we should always take it with a grain of salt. But in many documents, it's clear that there was a clash within the family. Many people could not understand how that bond between Shams and Rumi became so important. There was jealousy, there was the ego. All of us have ego.
With her.
Yeah. With her, especially, many sources emphasize that she was uncomfortable, the jealousy, and they make it sound as if it's a one-sided street, as if she was the one who was giving her love and sacrificing herself. But I tend to think that's also a very patriarchal interpretation, and maybe it's time for all of us to give more voice to the women, not only in Rumi's family, but also to women like Rabia and many others whose voices have been lost, like Ibn Arabi's teacher. We don't hear about these women, where are they? There are very few women we hear about when we look at the history of Islam. And of course that's not right, because there were so many women who were vocal, visible, and who left an impact. And I think it's our duty to inquire, to research their stories. With regards to how the establishment reacted, I think it was both ways. So sometimes people think that, because Rumi is so much loved today, he was always loved. First of all, there are many people who do not like Rumi's legacy and are constantly smearing his legacy. Today and yesterday it was the same. With Shams of Tabriz, it was even more so. As you know from their story, he attracted lots of reaction, lots of jealousies, and many people, because he was so straightforward, he would just speak his mind. He was not a diplomat. He would be a terrible diplomat, And when he criticized in the sharpest way. So many people didn't know how to deal with Shams of Tabriz. And as a result, he couldn't live in Konya. He had to go. Then he came back, and then, as you know, either he was murdered or he had to run away again.
The establishment may have felt that Rumi let them down because he was one of the most prestigious scholars, and then he completely had a reversal of personality.
Of course, but for the establishment, it's a matter of hierarchy. They think they know the truth, and their mission is to teach that truth to the masses. That's their approach. Whereas Rumi allowed his ego to dissolve. There is a remarkable passage, actually. There's a remarkable scene. As I mentioned, when they met, he was a scholar and he had lots of books. There are stories that he brought those books from Belk, from Afghanistan, not only his own books, but his father's books, because it runs in the family. As a result, they had this amazing library, and when Shams comes to his house, one of the first things he does is to throw his books into water and watch the ink dissolve. And it's quite symbolic because not that Shams was a book hater or anything, but it's a way of saying don't be so sure, don't be so certain, just don't put yourself above other people thinking that your mission is to teach. Are you also ready to learn? Don't think that your mission is to give sermons. Are you also ready to listen? Please.
In the books that you've written, for example, The Bastard of Istanbul, 40 Rules of Love, or 3 Human Beings, most of the characters, I feel like there's a constant theme of them try on this path to fill a void they have, and I feel like there's always been this sort of theme and constant theme of the novels, like the main characters trying to fill in that void and choose that void. Is there any particular idea behind that, or any sort of reason that you'd like to highlight? Because I mean, Islamically, we always say that you will always have that emptiness, a void within you, and that's only that space particularly for God. And you also mentioned this in Rules of Love as well from Ibn Arabi's theory. But for you personally, if you could tell us where it comes from.
I appreciate your question, yes. I hadn't thought of it that way, but as I'm listening to you, I totally hear what you're saying. I think it stems from the fact that I myself am a very flawed creature, and I think all writers are. Otherwise, we wouldn't be writing. There's so much that's broken in us or bruised, and we're constantly trying to lick our wounds and trying to mend our broken pieces. And that's how what you do when you're into art or literature. So it's a very much inward-looking journey, and I do honestly find similarities between writing fiction and mysticism, because I think in both there's a desire to go beyond the limits of the self. There's a desire to connect with the other to the point that there's no other anymore. Yeah? There's a desire to understand within this diversity, can I find oneness? So I really find lots of similarities, and it doesn't matter whether you're a woman or a man, you're at equal distance to the truth. That's why I like the shape of circle, which is widely used in Sufism and in all other mystical traditions, because in a circle there's no hierarchy. All the points are at equal distance to the center. I like that. So I think partly it originates from my own quest. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, life is a journey. When I look back at my books, I'm just fascinated to see how each and every one of them is different. They're so different. Of course, there are some common threads and themes, certainly, but their energies are different. When I look at The Bastard of Istanbul, I see more anger. When I look at the 40 Rules of Love, I see more calmness, and they're both me, just like they're both you, all of us, because we have all these different conflicting and clashing and coexisting voices inside us. The problem is in our daily lives, we tend to suppress the other voices. And we present ourselves as only one voice, one self, but that's not true. There are other voices. When you are writing fiction, I think you can be more multiple. Fiction allows you to do that. And in my work, in my novels, I like to bring together people or characters that are completely different and see what happens. I believe in cosmopolitanism. I'm a big believer in diversity. And I honestly think if we're ever going to learn anything in this life, we will learn it from people who are different from us. That someone who's exactly like me is only an echo of my voice, or I am an echo of their voice. And we don't learn from echoes, there's nothing to learn there. So for me, that diversity, I think, is precious. Maybe there's always a desire to be multiple. And if I may add this, one of my earlier books, Black Milk, also deals with this subject, because I experienced a postpartum depression that taught me a lot about the importance of inner democracy. Let me put it that way, because we usually tend to think of democracy as an external thing. At least I did that. I never thought, what about inner democracy? And when you go through a depression, because you fall down and all your parts, selves are just scattered, and you have to sit down and you have to reassemble yourself. And there's a chance that the new self can even be better than the older self, but that process is very painful. And I realized when I was going through depression that there was a hierarchy inside me in which I always appreciated the intellectual side of me and belittled the other sides of me, which could be more domestic, maybe more maternal, because I thought that wasn't important. I thought what mattered was books, what I produced, the intellectual voice. So that hierarchy collapsed. And in the book I write about it through humor. There's anarchy, there's huge chaos, but at the end of the day, I learned to make peace maybe with the different elifs inside me. I call them the Thumbelinas, and maybe achieve a better inner democracy. That's why I like fiction. I can reflect that multiplicity, which I believe exists in all of us, regardless.
I'm curious about where do you find your sources of inspiration to allow these voices to come out, and how much do you plan out the novel that you're creating versus allowing that to evolve and come to life as you create it?
Thank you. I think, generally speaking, there are two different ways of writing novels. One is a bit like engineering, in which the novelist knows what he or she, usually it's he, those who choose this path, but it could be both genders, in which the novelist knows what they're going to write, how they're going to end the story, what each character represents. So the structure, the architecture is there, is finely drawn beforehand. And then the second path is you start with intuition, with an instinct, maybe with an image, and you follow it without quite knowing what will happen 10 pages later, and allowing your characters to surprise you, to guide you, and not knowing how the story is going to end. You're a bit drunk, and you're not in control. I always felt the second path, and that's how I write. Of course, I also have to tell you, I have an academic background. I stayed in academia for many years, both in Turkey, but also in America, in Boston, Michigan, and then Arizona, Tucson, of all places. And maybe it gave me the certain discipline that's needed when you choose a subject, when you know more or less what you're writing about. I research it extensively, with a crazy hunger. I read everything I can find on that subject. And particularly when you're writing historical books, it becomes even more important. So the research part is very important for me. But afterwards, there comes a stage when you stop researching, and then you can fly. When you feel more confident with your research, and then wherever the story takes you.
Thank you.
Could you please talk, if you will, with these masters in any discipline? Individuals link with these masters, which is not a visible code.
Individuals linked with masters.
Individuals link with these masters.
Yeah.
In spiritual terminology.
Yeah.
Without any code, without any link.
Can individuals link with these masters?
Yes.
Am I hearing you correctly? But by masters, I hope you...
Well, anyway, from that point of view, my liking for Shamsuddin Tabriz.
Yeah.
So, how would I raise my...
Of course. I think people who have lived centuries ago can also be masters or guides. I use the word master cautiously because, as I said, I really don't like to fetishize anyone. And this was one of my biggest challenges as I was writing the 40 Rules of Love. Because on the one hand, I have a lot of respect for them and love for them. On the other hand, I wanted to present them as human beings. I don't like heroes, and you should allow them to make mistakes, to have conflicts. This is unthinkable. Like when we talk about Rumi in Turkey, I'm talking about people who love him, they think he was just completely perfect. Nobody's perfect if we are human beings. Can you approach like that? And this is not a bad thing. It means he also has his own journey. Of course, his journey is much more advanced than many other people's journeys, but he's also on a journey. So my approach is always more water-like, without seeing anyone as frozen or solid. But I do believe that we can learn so much from people, not only people who are alive today, but people who have lived in the past. That's why it matters enormously to me to read philosophy, not only fiction, philosophy, history, to understand human beings. But fiction is very important because it enables us to empathize, to put ourselves in the shoes of another person, at least for a few days, just to forget our own ego, just not to be myself. That is an amazing spiritual and intellectual exercise. That's why for me fiction is so important, because constantly we're surrounded by our own voice or voices, by our own truth, and we learn to take that for granted. When you stop being yourself and become somebody else, then maybe it enables you to look at the truth from a different angle. And maybe the truth will seem very different from that angle. So I really honestly think we all need that intellectual and spiritual exercise all the time, because we have very high egos, and we can never completely eradicate it, but we must know how our ego works. And this, as you might be familiar, is another debate within Sufism. There were people who said, no, we need to completely get rid of the ego. There's another approach that says you can't do that, and you need the ego, in fact, in order to exist as a human being. But what you need to do is to minimize it, but more importantly is to be aware of it, the knowledge of the ego. That when I act in a certain way, when I'm talking with another person, where did that come from? My anger, my jealousy, my envy, my reaction, where did that come from? The knowledge of the self, I think, is one of the crucial teachings in all mystical teachings across the world, East and West.
Can I just ask, the Sufism is very often associated with Islam, but I think it precedes Islam, doesn't it? Because I've also read that Pythagoras, mathematician, he was a Sufi. So, and there are Sufi elements in Christianity and Hinduism, with Vaishnavism. So what is it actually? Is it a religion or a way of thinking, or something which Islam picked up on the way, or was it there, or did it come out of Islam?
Thank you. Again, this is my interpretation, but when we look at the history, of course it goes all the way back centuries, and then you start noticing the influences. Especially in the early 10th century, 11th century, lots of influences from Far East. And this is the same with all religions and with all faiths. We tend to think that they made a completely new start on a clean slate, on a tabula rasa, but that's not the case. There's a continuity, and that continuity is beautiful. So the teachings of many centuries ago, of people who had nothing to do with Abrahamic religions, had an impact on Abrahamic religions. We usually talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition, but we rarely talk about the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. There was a continuity there as well. So I tend to think that it was like water. There are, in fact, scholars who say it was like rhizome. Rhizome is, when you forget a potato in the kitchen, and when you look at it weeks later, it goes in all directions. There's no center. So one branch went maybe towards Buddhism, one branch went towards Taoism, another branch went towards Sufism. Doesn't matter. The names will change depending on the region, but what is at the core is the quest itself. Us human beings, our need to make sense of our existence. As human beings, our need to understand time. What is time? What does it mean to be mortal? Is there an aftermath? Is there more to this journey? These are incredibly universal and timeless questions. Also, how we try to understand injustice. There's so much injustice in this world, so much cruelty, so much darkness. How do you deal with it? How do you explain it? So that core, I think, is very much the same. I really believe after a while the differences among the names don't matter anymore.
So that's why Pythagoras.
I wouldn't call him perhaps a Sufi, but I think he was a learner. He was someone for whom doubt was important, and who was open to learning. And to me, that's what matters, not the labels.
As a writer in Turkish, in English, talking talking about copyright in Arabic Persian. What is lost in translation?
Yes.
And what does a translator have to think about?
Thank you. There are things that are lost in translation, but there are also things gained in translation. And I think as writers, we owe such a big thank you to our translators. To be honest, I know books that are not as good in their original language as in their translated versions. And that is because the translator has put so much passion and effort and care, meticulous care into that work. And at the end of the day, they just keep their names behind, they just stay back. And when we look at a book, we never think of the translator of that book. So I think it works both ways. But just to give you a few examples, it mesmerizes me to see how books change as they move from one country to another or culture to another. One of my earlier novels is in Turkish, it's called İskender. And it is about a family, it's about an honor killing, and it questions masculinity, it questions how we raise our sons as the sultans in the family, and it also questions mother-son relationship and how women too take part in this patriarchal teachings. So the book was published in Turkey. When it was published here, my editor said, there's no way we can publish it as Alexander, which is the English version of Iskender, because people are going to think it's a book about Alexander the Great. So what shall we do? Let's choose the title Honor, because this is a book that focuses on honor. And that's how it was published in England. When it was going to be published in Italy, my Italian editor said, there's no way we're calling this Onore, because everybody's going to think it's about the mafia. So what do we do? Let's choose a poetic title, because our readers like that. And the name of the village in the book was the House of Four Winds. So the Italian title became The House of Four Winds. And go on and on and on. The same book with different covers, with different titles. I am okay with that. Some writers don't like that. I'm not disturbed by that at all, and just the opposite. It amazes me to see how differently we approach even words. However, I also believe that if we want to understand cultures better, we have to pay more attention. And I believe it was Salman Rushdie who said this in one of his articles. If you want to know a culture better, you have to focus more on those concepts that can't be directly translated from one language to another, and then ask yourself, why is that? So there are words like that from English to Turkish or vice versa, and of course in many other languages, but I think they tell us a lot about that particular culture if we can't translate a word directly. Please.
I would be interested in your view of what Rumi might think of Konya in the present day, and your, because I've only been there once, and I found that it was, to me, it wasn't a place of happiness. It was sad. Everything closed at 5 o'clock. You know, people weren't allowed out. I don't know whether the Sufis are happy with their meditations, but it just seems, at the moment, I wonder if this is what Rumi would have wanted for his place of being.
Such a good question. One of the reasons why I keep saying I don't want to over-romanticize anyone is because we shouldn't think that there are some Sufi groups that are completely outside of this world. I mean, I am sure there are individual people who are way up in their spiritual journeys, but I always approach with caution, because sometimes you run into Sufi groups who can be as patriarchal, who can be as sexist or as hierarchical as the rest of the society. You know, we all live in certain society with the same cultural formations, so it's better not to romanticize or not to think that anybody's going to be perfect. That's my approach, and rather than looking at people as role models, that's the reason why I prefer to focus on books, poems, philosophy, and think on my own. That's the journey that I found closer to my heart. But I think you're so right. I think Rumi would be very disappointed if he saw, I'm not talking about Konya solely, but this this weird construction craze that's going on, modernity without a sense of continuity, without paying attention to nuances. To be more clear, maybe I should mention Sinan, who was regarded as the greatest architect in the Islamic world. One of my previous books, The Architect's Apprentice, is about Sinan and his legacy. Most of Istanbul's landscape, cityscape, we owe to Sinan. He lived a very long life, and he was incredibly productive. He worked under different sultans, under very difficult circumstances, and more than 300 monuments, aqueducts including almshouses, mosques, amazing, caravansarais he left behind, not only in Istanbul, across Anatolia and the Balkans. Sometimes I ask myself, had Sinan been alive today, and if he had seen Istanbul today, what would he do? I really think he would have wept. I really think he would have cried. He was not only an amazing architect, also an amazing urban planner. And he knew that Istanbul was a city of earthquakes and fires. He was very careful about, the width of streets, the height of buildings, how to protect nuances coming from all the way back history. There was so much attention there, and that is what we have lost. So if Sinan would be unhappy to see Istanbul, I think Rumi would be unhappy to see Konya's state today as well. I'm sorry.
It's okay. First, I just wanted to thank you on a personal level, because it's rare when you find books that you connect with so deeply, but I have with yours and with all your characters, so thank you for that. But also I wanted to ask, in today's age where we live in such a fast lifestyle and everything is all, you're kind of bombarded with consumerism and materialism, how do you connect with anything spiritually or kind of feel like go back to basics? I mean, books is one method, but is there anything else that you would recommend?
Thank you so much. One thing I noticed in people who are interested in mysticism in general is their energy and how they refrain from harshly judging others. They're not judgmental, they shouldn't be. I've always learned from that, or tried to learn, because at least when you look at the teachings, mystical teachings, they always say, whatever you judge outside of you, never forget, also exists in you. Perhaps in me it's 5%, and in another person it's, let's say, 25%, but it's never zero in me, 0%, the thing that I don't like, and it's never 100 in that person. So in a way they're saying, be careful when you're criticizing, when you're labeling another, when you are othernizing people. Don't forget that you're connected and there are lots of similarities. I always love that. And they also say, we are the microcosmos. Whatever exists in the macrocosmos, the good and the bad, exists in us in different degrees. That is why there should be an inner struggle. That is why, for instance, for the Sufis, jihad was never trying to kill your enemies or warfare, nothing like that. When they talked about jihad, they said they were talking about the ego, the struggle against the ego. Completely inner-oriented, individual journey, because we have multiple voices, forces, energies inside. I like that modesty. I like that sense of connectivity, I think. Yeah, thank you. Please.
In relation to what you were saying now with the ego and the Sufi's perspective on it, I know that for myself and my friends, when reading Four Tools of Love, our opinions were a little bit split when it came to Shams al-Tabriz and his approach towards Kenya. Maybe this question was asked before, it came a bit late. I found I was on a little despised him a little bit after his kind of approach towards Kenya, whereas I found a lot of my friends from a cultural perspective understood and related to his I would say maybe his reactions towards her, the way she went about kind of trying to allure him and such. Was that your way of showing, because Shams came across as a very pious and a very complete individual, I know you spoke about that in San Kamil. Was that your way of showing that he's flawed, or I want to know what your perspective is?
Thank you so much. It's such a difficult question, but at the same time, it's a challenging question for me. And yes, I have been criticized, usually by women readers, saying, how can you allow Shams to behave like that to Kenya? And I think it was my way of saying he wasn't perfect either. And there's a part of me that believes someone like him wouldn't want to be seen as perfect either. I might be completely wrong. This is my take. And yes, we can criticize. So someone who seems very mature in his teachings, maybe in his own relationships with women or with friends, this or that, he might have flaws. But isn't this more realistic? And this is something I have learned from my own life, from my own experience with my own father. I grew up without seeing my father. As I mentioned, I was raised by 2 women. And for a long time, I found it very difficult to understand that disconnect. And it would have made my life easier to believe, as I used to believe back then, that my father was a horrible person, and look, that explains things. If he's horrible in every respect, and if he's horrible in your relationship with you, at least there's a consistency. But over time, and I've seen him very few times throughout my life, over time I realized he's someone who is very much beloved by his other children, by his sons, because he had a second marriage. And he was very much loved by his students as an academic. He was a very good democrat, a good thinker. There were lots of good things he did, lots of things he did very well in his life. And I believe he was a good person. But with me, his relationship was very flawed, this gap. And I think he made big mistakes there. Now, my interpretation of my father will never be the same as the interpretation from my brothers, who loved him and who were very close to him. And the story is both. Both my interpretation is his reality and my brother's. What I'm trying to say is, I think this is more realistic. We can be great academics, we can be great in what we do, in so many fields, but we have flaws. And those people maybe know those flaws better. And if you bring all those elements together, then you have a complete picture.
I'm sorry,
Oh.
we have one last question.
Really?
That's what we have time for. Sorry, come on.
So do you think you are like your father?
I think, I, to be honest, try to be a better parent. To be honest, I try to be a better parent, I think it was a mistake that he never came to see me as I was growing up. So I think he made mistakes. But what I'm trying to say is, in other parts of his life, he made lots of good things. Individually, I'm hoping I can be a better parent. Who knows? It's full of challenges. But that story taught me a lot. And I think each and every one of us, maybe not about parenthood, but about something else. And as writers, I have to tell you, in all honesty, I think we're very terrible wives or husbands, because being a novelist is a very self-centered job. We think we're little gods. We create universes, we create characters, and we have inflated egos. It is not a coincidence that many novelists hate each other. Talk to 2 novelists. You can't find 2 novelists who like each other. The only novelists we like are the dead novelists. And I'm always thinking, I also observe it in myself, we're constantly clashing because we have inflated egos. In all other areas of art, you learn teamwork. If you're a choreographer, you know teamwork. If you're a film director, you can still have an ego, but you have to learn teamwork, right? If you're a photographer, you have to learn teamwork. Work with the people you are photographing. There's only one area, and that is the life of a novelist, solely alone in his room, and thinking that we create the characters and finish their lives. Imagine what that does to your ego. So we usually are horrible, terrible partners, and I think that is definitely a flaw.
But intellectually, like your father. I'm not talking about parenthood.
Yeah, intellectually in what sense? Oh, you mean like he was an intellectual? Yes, of course, absolutely. He was an intellectual. I'm sure I have learned a lot from, even though I haven't seen him much, but that left an impact on me. Maybe I wanted to become a better intellectual. Maybe it gave me a motivation, who knows? But I also learned that, and that's something I owe to mysticism, the mind is very important, but the heart is very important as well. And there is something called emotional intelligence, which is largely underestimated. People who are very intelligent can have very poor emotional intelligence. There are different forms of intelligence, and I think it's very important to expand our emotional intelligence, which requires empathy, which requires connectivity. You know, so I respect both kinds of intelligence.
Are there any practices which can improve meditation?
I honestly, yeah.
Doing the wording there.
I honestly think each and every individual's path will be different, and I'm sure your heart will guide you. But for me personally, it was books, reading, researching, learning, and I know many artists who express it through their art, through their music, and amazing music, particularly the Naysans who play Ney. So they're very, very different paths, and that plurality itself, I think, is precious.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.